Welcome to Vintage SF. I'm Richard Rempel, and today I'm joined by Grammaticus of Grammaticus Books. Welcome, Grammaticus.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I sincerely appreciate it. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. This is my first live conversation that I've done here since I've been on BookTube, so this is a first for me.
Awesome. Well, I asked if Grammaticus would be reading Nine Princes in Amber because there's an event. I believe it's Michael K. Vaughan started this event. Is that correct?
I think he started it as a joke, and then I took it up and ran with it. But he does get credit for the idea. He did in fact come up with Ambuary last year. It's where he said he was going to read all 10 of the books of Amber. He's got 2 to go, by the way. Michael, if you're watching, you got 2 to go by the end of the month. And I thought that's a fantastic idea. And so I just ran with it and created Ambuary here and announced it on the channel.
And when he announced it, I said, all right, I'm in. I've been wanting to read some of Roger Zelazny's work, and Nine Princes of Amber seemed like a really good place to start. I've read some of his short stories, but I haven't read any of his novels yet.
And that's a bit out of your normal bailiwick, isn't it? I mean, you're typically in vintage science fiction and fantasy, and the Zelazny started off with sci-fi, but I mean, this is firmly high fantasy is what I would call it.
Well, you know what? My readings of Ursula K. Le Guin have opened me up to both science fiction and fantasy writing. And often those type of writers blur it a little bit. And once we get to talk about this story, I think there's a bit of blurring happening just with our real world and the fantasy world there too.
Absolutely, 100% correct. A blending of high fantasy and science fiction. And I think Zelazny really made that sort of an art for art form. And a term I kind of came up with to kind of describe that as Zelantasy, is how I refer to it as that of high fantasy and science fiction. But I think he does it really well.
So we have Ambruary and Zelantasy. Did I
Yes,
say that right? I love these made up words. You're going to have a glossary for your channel.
I will. That'd be a bad thing.
So when I'm talking to someone for the first time, I love to ask them what I call their SF or fantasy origin story. Where did your love for the genre come, or when were you introduced to it? And after you've talked about that, I'd like to hear how that translated into making a YouTube channel.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are 2 completely separate paths, but I'll start with, what led me into speculative fiction, both science fiction and fantasy. And I think like most people who watch this channel or channels like it, it was probably a similar story. I started very young. My elementary school was small, but they had an excellent library. And we always had to have an hour of library. It was either every day or every other day at school. And they had a complete collection of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne young adult abridged novels. Heavily illustrated, almost graphic novels, not quite, but they were close to graphic novels. And I discovered them in my elementary school library and just devoured them. And that was really my introduction to science fiction, which appropriately was, the 2 grandmasters, the great grandmasters of old, H.G. Wells and Jules Verne. And then at the same time, that same library, they had a wonderful collection of Greek mythology. And I just devoured the Greek mythology as well. And that was it's really just fantasy when you're reading those Greek mythologies. Theseus, Perseus, the 12 labors of Hercules, Jason and the Argonauts. And you're just reading adventure stories at that point. And that was really what led me into, and it was my gateway drug, so to speak, into science fiction and fantasy. And what sealed the deal was when I got out of elementary school, went into junior high, my parents bought me a box set of Robert A. Heinlein's Juveniles. And it was actually this box set. This is knocking stuff off here. It was this actual box set right here that I still have. Get that up there. That really sealed the deal for me for science fiction. Rocket Ship, stay. All right. And so it's Rocket Ship Galileo, Have Spacesuit Will Travel, which is probably my favorite of his juveniles. Red Planet, with which Pat over at Book Chat with Pat was just talking about Red Planet. And one thing I didn't know about that book that I learned on her weekly recap is this was heavily edited. The original version that Robert A. Heinlein submitted was so heavily edited that they they were changing words on almost every single page of that book, which had to have just been an enormous irritant for Heinlein, who was this libertarian who didn't like anybody messing with his stuff. But they recently reissued the unedited versions. Now I got to go out and get the unedited version of that. But this set of juveniles right here just sealed the deal for me with science fiction. And then I was in with fantasy as well, because it was probably about the same time that I wandered into a bookstore and, saw those marvelous Frazetta covers on those Conan Ace Lancer paperbacks. And that's what sealed the deal for fantasy with me. But that's pretty much what led me into speculative fiction, into science fiction and fantasy. BookTube is a bit of a more complicated story, but I'll start at the beginning for BookTube. I wasn't even aware of BookTube until 3 years ago. So I retired from a career in 2022. And when I was working actively, I was getting my news when I would drive into work or drive out to work, what I was doing. At the top of the hour, the bottom of the hour, you would get these short news clips. So you were just getting the facts of what the news were. But when I retired, I started getting my news off of YouTube. And that was a colossal mistake. Just a colossal mistake. And it doesn't matter whether, which side of the political aisle that you're on. You're not getting news when you get your news from YouTube. Instead, what you're getting is a very extreme political position that's not designed to inform you. It's just designed to make you angry. And once you click on one of those, the YouTube algorithm just reinforces it with this self-feeding circle, and then it just floods your inbox. And so I'm watching these news briefs, and it's just making me a cranky person, which is what it's designed to do. And that went on till a point where my wife said, "You have got to stop watching these YouTube news videos and do something different." And as usual, my wife was correct. And I was like, "You know what? You're right. It's making me cranky." And I went in and I just canceled every one of the subscriptions, took all of that out of my feeds, and I started looking for something to replace it that wasn't so acerbic. And just by accident, I stumbled onto BookTube, looking for something to replace these poisonous is really the right word for it, in my opinion, these poisonous YouTube newscasts. And I found it had to have been either Michael K. Vaughan or Steve Donahue that I stumbled onto initially. And if it wasn't one, then that one led me to the other very quickly. And then that expanded out to everybody else on BookTube. And it was just a breath of fresh air. It was exactly what the doctor ordered, to take all those news channels out of my feed. And really, it changed my whole opinion. My wife said, "You're much nicer to be around." It's like, one of the best things that you discovered was these BookTube channels. And it's fun, it's fresh, it's relaxing. And it's like the BookTube people they're my people, it's my tribe, that I was then replacing something that wasn't very nice with. And I was sold, I was in wholeheartedly. And I probably was watching BookTube for about a year when I decided to try and make a channel out of it. And what led me to that step to make my own channels, I'm watching these wonderful booktubers that are making these fantastic videos on vintage science fiction and fantasy and ancient history. And in the back of my mind, as I'm watching these videos, I'm thinking, but wouldn't it be really cool or neat if you asked question X, Y, Z? If you did a comparison between this author and that author, if you asked the question, what is the real end to Conan the Barbarian? If Robert E. Howard had lived, how would he have ended that if he hadn't, tragically taken his life when he was, 30 in 1935? And do videos on that. And I came to the conclusion that if I didn't make those videos, in all reality, they probably weren't going to get made. And that was sort of the push to try to take that plunge and open up a BookTube channel and start doing BookTube.
I love that it's is speculative on your own behalf of what could be the ending for something that made you think, I could talk about that. Nobody else is talking about that.
Yeah, it was fun. And those videos are the videos that I enjoy making the most. Those in my comic book videos, which get the fewest number of views of anything that I do. But yeah, that was a good video. The end of the Conan saga. What could be the real end of the Conan saga? And a number of pastiche authors have actually taken a stab at that. So you've got some examples that you can throw out there, and then you can pick from them. But yeah, it's a good time. But let me turn about as fair play. So let me ask you those same questions. What was your gateway into science fiction fantasy, and what led you to make a booktube channel?
Well, for me, I was a child of the 60s, and there were some very good science fiction shows in the 60s that my dad was watching on TV. And I can remember him watching the original Star Trek. I was just a young kid at that point, but I wanted to stay up and watch it. I think it was on Friday nights, if I remember right. And once I started going to school, a lot of these shows, like Star Trek, like The Twilight Zone, and others, became reruns that when I got home from school, I had a chance to watch a little bit of TV before supper, and I would see these shows, Lost in Space or Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, some of these classic American science fiction shows. And then in my middle school years, I had a great library in school again. And I remember starting to look for some of these type of novels. I wanted to read more science fiction. I enjoyed reading. I did look at some of the classics as you did, but ones that got me, that really hooked me, were the novel Planet of the Apes. It's not a
Oh,
novelization. It's an
yeah,
original novel by Pierre Boulle from 1963.
yeah.
Uh, it was fascinating. I loved it. And I actually found the movie a bit disappointing because it was very different. But now I love it for its own storytelling. And the other one that I loved was Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke.
All right.
That yeah, that one had these amazing paradigm shifts, not once, but twice, maybe even three times, where what you think you know and you're very curious about is not exactly what you think it is. And it's in some ways there's some themes that even 2001 continue to explore about the future of humanity and how we will eventually evolve. So those two novels while I was in middle school really sealed the deal. And media was my first introduction to science fiction when I was young.
Well, that's a great story. It sounds very similar. You had a great elementary school library or middle school library. And talking about Star Trek, and in fact, for the first time in ages, I actually watched two of the original Star Treks last night. It's an amazing coincidence. And then you got Pierre Boulle and Planet of the Apes and Childhood's Ends. Those are two really good ones to start you off and suck you in. I can see how those would work.
Hmm. And when it comes to the channel, I'm very similar to you. I don't think I've seen a booktube video until about 3 years ago. Uh, and it just happened. I was just newly retired. I had been doing things to try and get healthy, lots of cycling and a little bit of weightlifting. And I was starting to read books again, a little bit more than I had when I was more possessed with my career and family, raising a family. And I discovered Stephen E. Andrews, the outlaw bookseller, talking to one of his friends, and they called themselves the Two Grumpy Men Talking Science Fiction. And that video made me think, those guys are my age. That guy's a bookseller in Britain, and he has all this knowledge about these books. I think I'd like to start reading science fiction again to take something that I loved in my middle school years and into my youth and into my early adulthood and go back and revisit that. And so I started buying some of these books that they were talking about and reading them. And then I thought, I have opinions. I'd like to talk about this. And I had a bit of a background that I knew a little bit about using some movie editing software, just basic software like iMovie. And I thought, I can do this. I know that I stumble over words often, but I can edit so that it sounds like I'm putting complete sentences together. And it was a lot of fun. I just really enjoyed it. And it's given sort of a retirement hobby that I can get into. And really, it's not any more expensive than golf. It's a lot less expensive than golf or fixing up old cars or something like that, or woodworking. And my wife is wholly supportive behind it. Like your wife, I think she sees all the positives. I'm a bit of an introvert, and so she finds it funny that I'm talking to people like you and others online, and I've even met some of them in person. So it's really been a great journey over the last year and a half or so that I've been doing this channel.
That's a great story. It's interesting to think of yourself as an introvert because I watch your videos and I saw you go down and you were talking with Liminal down in Liminal Spaces in Arizona. I think that was down in Arizona or New
He's in
Mexico.
New Mexico in Albuquerque. Chris
That
of Liminal Spaces.
outgoing person. I always figured you had a very outgoing personality. But
Well,
your channel is great. And I saw that same channel, that same video that you were talking about. Two grumpy old men talk science fiction with the outlaw books. I saw that video as well. That was a really good video, and that's one of the channels I like a lot too. Is Outlaw Bookseller over there in England. He has such an encyclopedic and a complete knowledge of science fiction. He's
yeah,
always watch.
he is. And he's very giving. We actually just just recently finished a video with him talking about Philip K. Dick with my best of series with some of my friends, Ira and Matt. So doing a little name dropping here, but that's great. It's kind of fun, this community that we're building here. And who knows, maybe I'll get to Ohio and meet you someday too.
You're more than welcome. I'll show you the sites here, as meager as they are. I'll let and introduce them all. Do you by chance enjoy old comic strips and comic books at all?
I do. And your videos, I'm one of your loyal viewers of your videos on comic books. When I was a teenager into my adulthood, I kind of graduated, and that sounds weird, but graduated from science fiction into comics. It wasn't just superhero comics, it was more graphic novel type stories. And I started drawing and fooling around with that a little bit too. And
That's you do your drawings. I forgot about that. Yeah.
yeah. So actually, if people want to find them, I do have a website, vintagesf.ca, that you can look there. There's some ones that I've done in the past that are on there. So I have a very big interest in the art of comics, the art of sequential storytelling.
Well,
It's great.
the reason I asked that is because there actually is something that might draw you down here to Central Ohio. Central Ohio and the Ohio State University is the home of the Billy Ireland Comic Museum. It is the largest collection of comic books and sequential art in the world. And it exists on Ohio State University. And actually, a friend of mine actually drove up yesterday. It was a 2-hour drive for him in order to go and visit the museum. And I took him on a tour of that museum. And their collection of original artwork that the people were working on for Al Williamson, Frank Frazetta, Jack Kirby, and all of the old characters, and some of the new ones. Bill Watterson, they have original Bill Watterson work. Jeff Smith from Bone. It's an unbelievable museum there. So if you come down, we're definitely going to take you on a tour of the Billy Ireland Museum. That might actually be something could draw you here to Central Ohio.
Definitely. That sounds amazing. And I do remember seeing a video of yours where you were looking at Calvin and Hobbes Watterson's art in
That's
that
the one.
museum.
Yep, that's the one.
Yeah. Well, we're here to talk a little bit about the nine princes in Amber. When I
Yes.
first heard that title, I was thinking a little bit about Jurassic Park, and I was wondering if they would be frozen in amber. But but that came a lot later than this book. This book is from 1970, I believe.
Yep. First published 1970. Roger Zelazny, which I've been getting more and more into him as I discovered him as an author for the first time 3 years ago via Nine Princes in Amber. And after reading the Amber Chronicles, now I've been reading more of his science fiction, his new wave science fiction out of the mid to late 60s. But Nine Princes in Amber was my first introduction to Roger Zelazny, and I just devoured it. It was an amazing story to me, an amazing high fantasy adventure ride that was written with a quality of prose that, in my opinion, surpassed most of the other authors that I had read in the past. And I was like, how did I not know about this person? Where does this author come from? Because I had never heard of Roger Zelazny until I just stumbled on this 3 years ago. And Nine Princes in Amber is the introductory novel to the Amber Chronicles, which is split up into two segments. You have the first 5 novels, which is the Corwin cycle, which you follow. Corwin is the hero of that story. And then you have the last five novels that follow his son Merlin and the Merlin cycle. And this is the introduction, the starting novel there for the Amber Chronicles. And if you haven't read it, it's a Zelantasy. It is a high fantasy slash science fiction blending where you have the superpowered characters, and the universe revolves around Amber. And Amber is a city in a world that sits at the center of, basically, I guess you could call it the multiverse. And it is the only true, real world in the entire universe. And then all other worlds, including our Earth, are shadows or reflections of Amber. And as you get farther and farther away from Amber, the true heart of the universe, the only real world, these reflections become more and more unstable. And you have the princes of Amber, who are the sons of Oberon the king. And at the start of the novel, your hero Corwin is waking up in a hospital bed on Earth, 1970, our Earth, not the Amber Earth. And you've got that trope of the amnesia where he has to figure out what's going on. And you slowly realize that there's a power vacuum in Amber at the heart of the multiverse. And now you have these 9 princes that are all vying for the throne. Very much like Song of Fire and Ice by George R. R. Martin, who was a close friend of Roger Zelazny in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I can't help but think that there was a lot of influence there between those two authors who loved to hang out and go out to a dinner together in Santa Fe, New Mexico all the time. But I know that this is a little bit out of your bailiwick, but you do fantasy. But I'm very curious to hear what your thoughts were on reading The Nine Princes in Amber.
So I know that you've reread it, so it's the second time that you've read it.
Yep.
This is my first time, and I haven't gone beyond the first novel. So my first impression was, I think I'm reading about Jason Bourne. This guy has amnesia. He's in a hospital. It becomes an adventure sequence as he escapes, and he's trying to figure out who he is. And he finds out that he has a name of a person who ends up becoming, ends up being his sister that he goes to, but he's not sure if he can trust her. There is a big chunk of the beginning of this novel that is set here on Earth where you have no clue that there's a fantasy element coming. Well, you do because you know it's part of a series. But I was very surprised by that. And I was taken in by it. And I thought this is a great way for somebody who doesn't read a lot of fantasy to be introduced to this world. And so I was immediately page turning, wanting to find out what was going to happen next. And it was very interesting how they are able to travel between the worlds. It's almost like they're wandering and walking and taking certain turns that take them away from the Shadow Earth and into and closer to Amber, this real realm that exists. And he's just trying to lead people on in all his conversations to figure out who he is. And I think that almost goes for a third of the novel before he finally confides in one of his relatives and says, you know what? I have amnesia. Can you fill me in? And they come up with a plan for him to be able to regain his memory in a mere city of Amber. Amber is the best city ever. It always describes it so much better than all these other cities and have these charms to it. But there's a mere image of it at the bottom of an ocean, I think it sounds like.
Yes.
And it's Amber reversed, Rebma. Rebma. I only figured that out recently. I didn't recognize it right away. So something that's driving the novel is that there's all these princes and their sisters. Their father, at least it seems like he's passed away. I'm not sure if he's really passed away. And like I've said, I haven't read past the first novel. But his brother Eric is on the throne and wants to be have a coronation on the throne. And the main character, Corwin, decides that he has some of the backing of some of his family and he wants to stop that from happening. Eric's not a good guy. He thinks that he's the one who should deserve to be on this throne, that he would be a much more benevolent, kind, good ruler, which I'm not sure because we still have this amnesiac version of Corwin. And when we hear things about the real Corwin, he seems to be a little bit more of a jerk.
Yes.
Um,
I think his amnesia actually has made him a more conscientious and caring person. His accident, his amnesia actually has improved him and made him more fit for the throne of Amber. And you're talking about, how long the book goes before he actually admits that he has this amnesia. I got curious about that myself. It's page 69. You have to go through 69 pages of him being an unreliable narrator and playing this game of cat and mouse with his relatives, with his sister. I think it's Flora, where he travels to her address that he lists on the hospital he wakes up in, and they have this conversation going back and forth where he's trying to extract as much information as he can without giving away to her, which would be deadly to him, that has amnesia. And then for me, those parts of the book were the most interesting, the most engaging, is where he's having these dialogues where he has to engage in sort of this sword play, this duel of wits with his relatives to try to figure out what's going on and reconstruct the world that he lives in. And that's where you start to learn that there's more than just an individual on Earth, but there's these other worlds where your universe expands from this one person in the hospital in 1970s Earth to this reality that encompasses just multitudes and multitudes of these possible shadow realms. And that's when you get that realization, I think that's where the book really kind of hits home that, okay, we're in for something much larger than just, somebody trying to figure out their past history of the last year or so, that you're putting together this entire multiverse. And there's these superhuman, almost demigod-like beings that are engaged in this internecine warfare in order to, figure out who's going to rule this multiverse.
in Rebna, he follows this maze that helps restore his memory. And once he has his memory, we get into and I don't want to go too far with this, but a consolidation of forces to go against his brother. And I don't want to reveal how that plays out, but it's not resolved.
No.
And there's consequences for things that aren't resolved. And we end at a point where we know there's going to be more, that there is a promise of further conflict to come. And we are learning more and more about this big family. By the way, this family is huge. Like
Yes.
of the nine brothers and five sisters, I think, and there's some that are dead. So there was even more brothers before as well. So I'm kind of curious about how that plays out. I know that you're not going to tell me, but this huge family, I think that there must be some ramifications coming up in the next four novels because of that as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there absolutely are. And and I'm going to jump back to something you said earlier because I thought it was just an excellent analogy where you called it Jason Bourne-like, and that's the perfect description. I think you hit the nail right on the head. This does start like a Jason Bourne novel, and then expands out into this fantasy universe that just takes it out of the real world and into this fantasy realm. That's a perfect description of it, the Jason Bourne. But yeah, he does it. The novel wraps up. It wraps up very satisfactorily as a novel by itself, by a standalone. But at the same time, leaves no doubt that you have this ongoing conflict that is going to continue for several more novels. And I think it you can read it and walk away from that novel. Although it does have that big teaser, sort of the cliffhanger. Not really a cliffhanger is the wrong word. The promise that there is far more adventure within this universe to come, and the lure to go out there and get those additional novels.
And I certainly want to read on. It did work for me in terms of that. I also want to just mention Zelazny's first. Ludlam wrote Jason Bourne later on.
Yeah, yes, that's correct. Much later on.
Although I'm sure that the theme of an amnesiac trying to figure out who he is something that's played out over centuries already in terms of themes.
If not millennia.
Yeah.
Yes, he can't
So,
claim the origin on that one.
so I think you can tell that we both really enjoyed this novel. Uh, who would you recommend it to?
Well, I would recommend it if you enjoy fast-paced adventure stories, then I think you're going to like this. Again, I think you have just been killing it with the description of this novel. It's a page turner. You mentioned it's a page turner. This is a novel where the action is continuously going. You're continuously learning more about Corwin as he progresses through the novel. The adventure builds. The prose is excellent. So if you like a fast-paced page-turner adventure novel with very little navel-gazing going on in it, then you're going to like this book. He writes these conversations, these sparring matches and conversation that take place that are almost like a fencing match between the characters that I think are very interesting. And it's very different from his earlier works. That's one of the things that struck me is how versatile Roger Zelazny is as an author, because he starts off writing what is definitely just hardcore new wave science fiction in the mid to late 60s. And then he transfers here in 1970 with Nine Princes in Amber to what is just an adventure ride, a joy ride in a gold Mercedes shooting down the highway at 80 miles an hour in this fast-paced adventure. And if that sounds like something that's fun to you, a fast-paced high fantasy adventure novel, then you can't go wrong with this. It's so well written.
I agree. The mental jousting that happens when he's trying to figure out who he is just as good as the physical jousting of some of these sword battles. I think, in fact, I might have liked it more.
I agree.
So you have those two components which really draw you into the story. Definitely recommended, I would say, from both of us here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Now, I actually would like to mention the last video that you made was how Zelazny has been neglected in the eyes of some of the awards or perhaps some of the science fiction and fantasy fans. Do you want to just give us a little kernel of what your argument was from that last video?
Yeah, and neglected is probably a really good word. I think I use the word disrespected, but neglected might be actually a better description of it. And like I'd said, I had never heard of Roger Zelazny until 3 years ago. And I'm a fairly avid reader of science fiction and fantasy, and I'd never come across his works until 3 years ago, which it's unbelievable considering the volume of work that he wrote and the quality of the work that he wrote. And as I've been learning about him over the last 3 years and what a impact he had on the world of science fiction, particularly as one of the originators of new wave science fiction in the United States of America, and the awards, just the novels that he was turning out in the mid to late 60s that were winning Hugos and Nebulas, and then Balrogs and Locus Awards. And the fact that he hasn't been recognized as a Grand Master by the Science Fiction Writers of America seems like a gaping hole in their resume, that they missed out on Roger Zelazny. And all of the grandmasters that have been appointed in there, it's been 40 since 1975, and they're all deserving of it. But when you look at some of these grandmasters and you see what the standard is in order to be nominated and then elected as a grandmaster, Roger Zelazny by far and away meets and exceeds that. Now, I think there were a couple of factors that impacted that, and a lot of people who watched that down in the comments section put excellent comments in there. His early death in 1995 probably impacted that. They might not have had time to vote on him because in order to be nominated for that award, you have to be a living author. The other thing that I think also impacted it that people were putting in the comments section that I think was very good points is that in the 60s, he's doing sci-fi. And then starting in 1970, he switches over to what is primarily a high fantasy series that becomes his most popular series of books. And at that point, I think people stop looking at him as a science fiction author and looking at him more as a fantasy author. And that may have impacted the Science Fiction Writers of America's decision not to, nominate him before his death. However, they have other awards that they could, go back and retroactively recognize him with. The Emeritus Award, the Infinity Award. The Infinity Award's only been out for 2 years. So it will be interesting to see going forward if the SFWA does at some point put Roger Zelazny up for an Infinity Award.
I think they have to. I think, as you're saying, it is a huge hole in their award system that Zelazny hasn't got this already, some sort of a recognition like this. And I will put a link to your video in the bottom of this one if you'd like to watch. He has a great explanation of all the different awards and why perhaps Zelazny didn't get this award, but why he is so deserving of it. And that really topped off my appreciation for the Nine Princes in Amber, because I'm going, hey, I know that this guy has great novels out there. I have read some of his science fiction short stories, in particular, A Rose for Ecclesiastes, believe it's called, which was an unbelievable literary story on Mars. And so I'm looking forward to reading more Zelazny.
Yeah, there are a number of novels I think you would like a lot. The Dream Master, I think I've got that. Yeah, I think you would enjoy this one. It is a really interesting science fiction. This is all pure science fiction here from 65, if I remember correctly. I think you would like that one. The writing in it is just phenomenal. Some of the sci-fi ideas in it are very original and really interesting to read about. The plot, I think he loses control of the plot a little bit on it, so I'll go give that caveat to that recommendation. But I would be very interested to see what your take on the Dream Master is.
I will definitely get to it someday. I've been collecting some of his books.
Go put it on that lengthy TBR list that we all have.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I really couldn't think of someone who I'd want to talk to more about Zelazny, especially after your last video. So I appreciate being part of Amberwary.
You are most welcome. Thank you for inviting me to take place in this video. I enjoyed it immensely, Richard, and I look forward to your future videos.
And let's see if you remember what my outro is here. Until next time.
Oh, you're gonna embarrass me right here at the end. I can't come up with keep reading.
Yes, that's it.
Oh,
Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Until next time.
keep reading.
All right. Thank you so much, Grammaticus.
Thank
That was
you.
a lot of fun.
It was. Take care.
Rebma. Is that how you would say it?
Redma. R-A-D. And I have to make a confession here. Until you just said it, I didn't realize that it's Amber backwards.
Ah.
So thank you. Thank you for that revelation. It just made the book even better in my eyes. But yeah, it's Amber backwards, Redma.
So do you mind if I keep this part in the video?
I don't mind at all.
All right. So this will be a little bonus section, I think.